What does addiction truly look like when the glamour fades, the money runs out, and the absolute nightmare begins?
Okay, let's jump right into this incredibly raw explainer. Today, we're tracking the terrifying, unvarnished realities of substance addiction. We're going to be looking really closely at the true stories of two men, Kiji Hamilton, who actually used to play music with the legendary Fela Kuti, and Abraham Okaduga. Their stories, they take us through this harrowing, literal descent into addiction, and then, thankfully, their hard-fought ascent back to life.
But before we get into the clinical details or the psychology behind it all, we've got to ask ourselves a fundamental question. What does addiction truly look like when the glamour fades, the money runs out, and the absolute nightmare begins? Because trust me, it is not what you see in the movies.
I mean, listen to this. This jarring reality is exactly what Abraham experienced. He said his body was literally decaying while he was still alive. It's a journey of absolute life and death. So the really crucial thing we need to figure out is, how does a perfectly healthy, ambitious young person even get to this horrifying stage in the first place?
Well, that brings us to Section 1, the roots of addiction.
First things first, we have to absolutely shatter the myth that addiction is just about, kids chasing a weekend thrill. Kenji brilliantly makes this distinction. He points out that while physical painkillers are prescribed to numb a physical ailment, drugs are almost always abused to numb a deeply rooted psychological pain. For Kenji, that pain was being forced into a career path he hated by a super strict father. But for Abraham, it was unimaginably darker. As a highly dedicated child evangelist, he suffered horrific sexual abuse from a mentor he trusted. It completely shattered his worldview and his entire identity. And the tragedy is, when these young men tried to process this immense pain, they had nowhere to turn. KJ points out that outdated, authoritarian parenting often completely severs that vital connection between parent and child. He calls it using the old syllabus of parenting, where kids learn pretty quick that they can't confide in their parents without facing judgment or even violence. So, where do they go? They end up taking that psychological pain straight to the wrong crowds.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 2, chasing the first high.
You hear the term gateway drugs tossed around a lot, right? Well, Abraham's journey to the brink of death didn't just start with needles. No way. It started with smoking Cuban cigars and weed in university. Why? Because society kind of normalizes these things. They act as these initial stepping stones that lower your inhibitions, and they literally open the door to experimenting with heavier, way more lethal narcotics. Now, this part is super fascinating. Abraham introduces this myth-busting concept he calls superiority influence. We always talk about peer pressure, right? But Abraham argues he didn't actually succumb to traditional peer pressure. Instead, he had this really low self-esteem that caused him to elevate the rich kids at his university. Because they had the money and the status that he deeply envied, he viewed them as superior. And so he naturally just started copying their toxic habits, like smoking weed and drinking codeine, just to feel like he belonged on their level. And man, it is wild how fast this escalation happens. Abraham goes from cigars to weed to codeine. But the real fatal trap, that springs in his mid-20s. He got a mild case of pneumonia from riding his motorcycle, and instead of taking a simple antibiotic, he goes to a local chemist who injects him with pentazocine. Now, pentazocine is a heavy, intravenous painkiller meant for severe surgery or sickle cell patients. The physical pain vanished, sure, but he was instantly hooked on this hours-long euphoric rush that followed. Boom, the trap had snapped shut. So, what happens next? Section 3, the brutal physical toll. The specific mechanics of how these drugs destroy the body are just terrifying. While Abraham was injecting pentazocine and dealing with actual rotting tissues, Kiji's reality was different but equally horrific. As a touring musician, Kiji got hooked on this lethal seesaw of uppers and downers. He'd smoke crack cocaine for intense energy to perform, which caused crippling paranoia. Then, to counter that paranoia and forcibly put himself to sleep, he would basically step down by smoking heroin, a severe depressant. His body became a battleground of extreme chemical reactions. Let's jump back to Abraham for a second. 60. Let that number sink in. That is the staggering number of ampules of pentazocine Abraham was eventually injecting directly into his veins every single day, just to function. 2 packs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 2 in the evening. And human bodies just aren't built to survive that. Because he was injecting so frequently, his veins collapsed entirely. They became completely unusable. His flesh literally began decaying from the inside out, emitting this odor so foul that he actually lost his corporate job. When he ran out of healthy skin on his arms, he moved to his legs. And when the flesh rotted away to expose the bone, he was so desperate for a high that he would look for the cracks in his own decaying bones to inject the drug directly into his marrow. It is just unbelievable.
Which brings us to section 4, hitting rock bottom. Abraham's descent stripped him of absolutely everything. The guy sold his beloved Harley-Davidson power bike and all his electronics just to buy more drugs. He ended up completely homeless, wandering the streets with a walking stick, with literal maggots crawling out of his open wounds. He was so filled with self-hatred that he survived 3 separate suicide attempts. And Kiji experienced a similar total loss, spending 9 full years completely homeless, sleeping on the streets. It just goes to show, addiction destroys without prejudice.
So Abraham asked this incredibly profound question during the interview. He said, if you're in a police cell, someone can pay bail. If you're locked in a room, someone can break the door down. But how do you save an addict who is entrapped in their own mind? You can't exactly rescue someone whose brain is actively tricking them into self-sabotage, constantly prioritizing the drug over basic survival. But there is a way out. Section 5, the lifelong recovery path. Both of these men emphasize that recovery isn't just about stopping the drug. It is a rigorous, multi-step process. First, you've got to trace and address that root emotional trauma, that psychological pain we talked about at the beginning. Second, establish strict accountability with someone you really respect. Third, enter formal medical rehabilitation. And finally, you absolutely have to replace the drug's high with something else. For both men, that meant finding a deep spiritual and emotional grounding to fill that void. But wait, here is a critical warning from Abraham. You have to beware the trap of idleness. After his very first stint in rehab, he felt a bit overconfident. He went back home to an empty room with absolutely nothing to do. And because he was idle and alone, his brain quickly started craving that shortcut to happiness again. And tragically, he relapsed. Staying busy and engaged isn't just a good idea, it's a literal matter of survival. And survival is possible, guys. 32. That's the number of years Kiji Hamilton has been completely clean. Yeah, 32 years. After a profound spiritual awakening in a hotel room in 1994, where he realized the drugs were finally going to kill him, he dropped the habit cold turkey. He spent the last 3 decades dedicating his life to helping hundreds of other addicts pull themselves out of the abyss. Abraham perfectly captures the tragic lure of drugs with his thought. He admits, really frankly, that the high feels incredibly good. That's exactly why people do it. But that temporary escape, it is so heavily outweighed by the permanent destruction it brings. The price you pay is simply not worth it. So I want to leave you with this final thought. We've seen today that addiction isn't just a moral feeling, it is a desperate, fatal attempt to cure profound psychological pain. If we truly understand the trauma at the root of this nightmare, how can we finally stop judging the fallen and instead start offering the radical empathy required to actually help them up? Think about that for a bit, and I'll catch you on the next